afternoon, good evening. I am Ed Wright, the director of the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture, the Raphael Pattay Memorial Lecture. Let me first start by today giving just a brief introduction about Professor Pattay. Raphael Pattay lived from 1911 to 1996. He passed away in Tucson at the age of 85. He had moved here in retirement to be with his daughter, Jennifer Schneider. Born in Hungary, he, like most of the Jewish youth of his generation, got his early training in Jewish studies at a seminary, in fact, the famous Breslau Rabbinic Seminary. And then he got his doctorate at the University of Budapest. He made Aliyah, moved to Israel in 1933 at the age of 21, and eventually enrolled at the Hebrew University. Professor Pattay received the Hebrew University's first degree in cultural anthropology. Now, looking back at Professor Pattay's scholarly life and productivity, I really have to say I stand in awe. He wrote dozens of books, hundreds of scholarly articles, and was in many respects, I would say, a model of scholarly productivity. This was combined with his encyclopedic knowledge and learned creativity. I want to highlight just one of his books, one that's important in my field, because I get to choose. That's the book I'm choosing. His book, The Hebrew Goddess, was published in 1967. This book traces the evidence for a divine consort, God's wife, that was worshipped in ancient Israel. Now, in 1967, when he wrote this book, there really was no extra biblical evidence for a divine consort. He inferred this from the biblical texts and later traditions. The idea was, in its time, to be quite honest, scandalous that God should have a wife. But he was way ahead of his time. Later, 1971, our own Bill Deaver, excavating at Kirbet El Kom near Hebron, discovered an inscription that mentioned, that said, may he be blessed by Yahweh and his Asherah, his consort. Pattay was way ahead of his time. And interestingly enough, we connect the University of Arizona, where he came in retirement, and Professor Deaver, who was head of the archaeology program here. He wrote many other books. One of them, The Myth of the Jewish Race, he wrote with his daughter, our own Jennifer Schneider. His daughters now survive him. Jennifer Schneider here in Tucson, and Professor Daphne Pattay in Amherst. And they have endowed this lecture in their father's honor. And we at the University of Arizona are very proud to be a part of the tradition that keeps his memory alive. He passed away, but his memory remains a blessing. And his books, Opportunities for Growth and Learning. Today, we have a special opportunity to learn from someone who is also a marvelous scholar in her field. Professor Andrea Berlin holds the James R. Weissman Chair in Classical Archaeology at Boston University. She received her PhD from the University of Michigan, and prior to her appointment at BU, Dr. Berlin taught at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, George Washington University, the University of Virginia, the University of Maryland, Georgetown University, and the University of Minnesota. She has received dozens of grants and fellowships to support her teaching, her research, and her archaeological field work. She has held research fellowships from the W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem, the American School of Oriental Research, the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, Harvard University, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies, the Rafik Hariri Institute, and the Elie Wiesel Center for Judaic Studies. As you can see, that kind of support shows the quality of work that she's done and the volume of work that she's done. She has been excavating in the Eastern Mediterranean now for over 30 years, working on projects from Troy in Turkey to Coptos in southern Egypt and to Paestum in Italy. In addition to her exemplary record of scholarship, Professor Berlin is also known as a leader within the Academy, serving as a board member for the W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research, the American Schools of Oriental Research, and the Archaeological Institute of America. Her specialty is the Near East, from the time of Alexander the Great through the Roman era. She is the author or editor of 6 books and 70, now probably over 70 articles in that area. As you will see, she is especially interested in studying the realities of daily life and in exploring the intersection of political and cultural change in antiquity. In fact, her recently published book, The Middle Maccabees, is an excellent example of exactly this kind of insightful scholarship. I just ordered my copy, and I encourage you to do the same. Professor Berlin's lecture today is entitled A Tale of Two Peoples, Phoenicians and Jews at Kedesh. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andrea Berlin. Andrea, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Here we go. Let me just quickly make sure that everybody can see and hear. I can see the chat, so if there's some problem with video or audio, please write in and let me start. A Tale of Two Peoples, Phoenicians and Jews at Kedesh. You are looking, perhaps in a disoriented way, at a landscape that might be familiar to you, but not from this direction. You're looking south along the eastern Mediterranean coast from the region that is today southern Lebanon, south into the region that is today Israel, with the Sinai Peninsula disappearing off into the upper right-hand corner of your screen. From this vantage point, it is perhaps easier to appreciate something that is generally hard for us to realize, and that is the overlap between the territories, the interests, and the histories of the ancient Phoenicians, one of whose major city-states was at Tyre, and the predecessors of the modern Jews, the ancient Judeans or Judahites, Israelites, the peoples who lived in what is today modern Israel and whose capital was at Jerusalem. We've got 2 cities up here on the map, but you know, in antiquity, cities were not just cities. Cities were territories. Cities had all kinds of land involved. The territory of Tyre extended all the way into the interior of what we think of today as the upper and the lower Galilee of Israel. This was a huge mountainous plateau that ran continuously from the eastern Mediterranean coast of Tyre all the way to the sharp edge of that plateau, which is today overlooking the Hula Valley in northern Israel. And the territory of ancient Judea or Judah extended in various time periods as far north as this same territory. So as you can see, there's a pretty significant area of overlap. And in exactly that area of overlap is the site of Kedesh. Now today we're going to be looking at Kedesh as and this region as a whole as a place in between. It's a place in between territory. It's a place in between topography. It's a place in between 2 different people's histories. It's a place in between 2 different people's sense of what belonged to them. And it's also a place between kinds of evidence. How do we get to the past? One of the ways that we get to the past is by reading about it from books and texts that people in antiquity wrote their own histories. And as you all know, another way that we get to the past is by digging it up. And that's the way we're going to start with today. So you're looking here now northward at the enormous mound of Tel Kedesh. Where we first came in 1997 to excavate. You may understand the significance of Kedesh in this story when you see how it is situated even today, because it is exactly on the border between the modern successors of the Judeans and the Phoenicians, that is Israel and Lebanon. And that little bit of road that you can see immediately between where I've written Lebanon and Israel, that is the border road that runs along the northern part of the country. In fact, the very northernmost edge of the huge mound of Kedesh was cut off when that border road was made. That's how close it is today to the modern border. So in 1997, we came to Kedesh and we had a really simple question. Our question was, what was life like on a border in antiquity? We knew that just as today, in the past, Kedesh was on the border between Phoenicia and Israel, between Phoenicia and Judea. And we wondered which side it rested on politically, and more to the point, which side it rested on culturally. How did people who live here relate? Who did they relate to? And how did those relations affect their lives? So that's what we were interested in looking for. The picture that I just showed you a couple minutes ago of people standing and excavating, they were standing at the spot that I just put that red arrow. So you can get a sense, if you can remember that picture, how big the mound of Tel Kedesh is. It's almost a kilometer from the northern end of the mound to the southern end of the mound. In 1997, we started by digging a small little test trench down here towards the southern end of the mound. When I say small, I mean small, pretty much the size of an elevator shaft. That's me with the X on my back and one of our student volunteers in this tiny little elevator trench of a hole, just to see if we could find out how far down we would have to go before we hit remains of the period that we were interested in. You see that my hand is resting on a stone and there's an open notebook resting on some other stones. Those stones were part of a wall. Inside the room, there was a trough, there was a stone mortar. You see a vessel sitting inside that trough. In fact, in this tiny little half an elevator-sized piece of room, there was a flask, 5 juglets, a cooking pot, 2 loom weights, 5 stone grinding stones, a spindle whorl, a little ointment jar. I like to say, and a note saying, be back, gone for milk, be back in 5 minutes. When you find something like this, which we don't find very often in archaeology, when you find this much whole material sitting on the ground, just waiting, people left in a hurry. What makes people leave in a hurry? Pretty much the same things in antiquity as happen today. What makes people leave in a hurry is conflict. What makes people leave in a hurry is war or battle. Now, I could tell from this pottery that the people who had left here in a hurry had left in the 2nd century BCE. That's the date of this material. And it didn't take us long to come up with the reason that those people probably left. First Maccabees, chapter 11. Jonathan, you may recall, is the younger brother of Judah Maccabee. Jonathan heard that the generals of Demetrius, he's the king of the Syrians, Demetrius, the Seleucid king. Jonathan heard that the generals of Demetrius had come with a strong force to Kedesh in Galilee, so he went to meet them. The army of the foreigners made an ambush, and all of Jonathan's men fled. Jonathan rent his garments and prayed. He turned them again to battle, and they fought. They pursued their enemies to Kedesh. 3,000 of the foreign troops fell, and Jonathan returned to Jerusalem. The text of First Maccabees doesn't give dates in and of itself, but it puts events in order. It links them with kings. We know the dates of those kings, and from the text and those dates, we know the date of the battle that this event was. 143 BCE, the middle of the 2nd century, exactly the date of all of those pots sitting in the middle of a floor, deserted at Kedesh. Well, it looks like life on the border was the same in the past as it is so often in the present. And now you all have a little piece of homework. Remember this text and remember this date. When we discovered that little elevator shaft in the ground, we knew that we had something important to discover here. We came back the next year and did a huge magnetometric survey all across the lower mound. You know, these maps that you get from a magnetometric survey, I'm not going to lie, they kind of look like you took a big 5-pound bag of rice and you dumped it out on your table. It's not very easy to see any outlines, but you can see in the bottom lower right where I've put that yellow box. If you squint a little, you might be able to make out what look like the outlines of a large building. And over the next 10 years, that's exactly what we found. We found a 20,000 square foot building that had been abandoned in a hurry in the middle of the 2nd century BCE and never reoccupied. What was in that building? What was it used for? Well, because everybody left in such a hurry, we found room after room with objects sitting on the floor. Like this, for example, a huge storeroom with jars lining the walls. We could put those jars back together. Now, sadly, we're not all together in one room, all of you people phoning in and looking in from across the United States. But if you know me, which some of you may, you know that I'm about 5'1" in height. And that's the same height as this jar. I like to say, for a person, I'm on the small side, but if you think of me as the size of a jar, that's a very good size. These jars were really enormous. They were like cupboards all by themselves. We did residue analysis on the bottoms, on the inside bottoms of these jars, and we were able to recover phytoliths, the small husk of plants. And the phytoliths that we found from inside this jar told us that they held wheat, bread wheat, Triticum aestivum. That's a phytolith of bread wheat from the 2nd century BCE. So this was like a giant granary. In the room immediately next to the storeroom, so here's the storeroom right here on the left-hand side, and here is the room up in the corner of the building. And in that room, in the corner of the building, in a pile on the floor, we found something pretty surprising. You can see this student looking intently as she's sifting objects, and she's made a nice little pile of what look like dirt pellets in one corner of her sieve. And every single one of those pellets is a stamped clay ceiling. We found over 2,000 stamped clay ceilings inside this one room in the corner of the building. What are these ceilings? Well, in antiquity, in this period, if you wrote a contract, wrote a letter, paid your taxes, made a will, wrote a lease, you wrote it on papyrus, you rolled it up, you tied it with twine, you took a little piece of clay and you smushed it around the twine, and then you took your signet ring and you stamped that clay in order to show, like the return address on an envelope, whose document this was. So everybody has a different signet ring, and every sealing is a different return address. Most of these clay ceilings from the archive room were of private individuals. You see in the upper left a panther holding a javelin and looking straight out. And you see in the upper right Aphrodite getting out of her bath and sponging herself off. And you see in the lower right a woman seated and looking at a flower. Next to her, you see a little Eros, a little winged Cupid figure. And above the two of them, you see the impression of an Athena holding a spear and the victory figure of Nike in one hand. So all of these are private ceilings. They're not very big, as you can tell from the two of them that are in the palm of my hand. That's actually my hand there in the lower left. But a few of these ceilings were official ceilings. And of them, possibly the most interesting is this one, of which we had about a dozen. And this ceiling, unlike most of the rest of them, had writing on it. The writing is in either Aramaic or Phoenician. They look the same at this time. And it says Ash al Aretz, which means he who is over the land. He who is over the land. And the figure above the inscription is the lunar deity Tanit. She is a deity of the Phoenicians. So we have here in the middle of the 2nd century BCE at Kedesh, a Phoenician official who has some kind of jurisdiction over a significant amount of territory. And he is proclaiming his jurisdiction in his own language and with his own deity. Elsewhere in the building, we get some information about what this official may have been exercising his jurisdiction over. Because here in the southern part of the building, we found a really interesting set of complexes where I've just put those yellow and blue translucent boxes. There are big plastered bins. This is a room filled with bins, and there were several other bins adjacent to it, and then in a room next door, yet another bin, this time one with a hole. And so we've got a whole series of bins for dry commodities and a special bin for what must have been liquid commodities. So we're supposing the first group of bins would have been for grain, for wheat, maybe the kind of wheat that eventually went into those giant store jars in the storeroom. And then in this special room that had its one special bin that was for liquid, maybe that was for wine. And I always like to think that because this room, as you can see, this special room with the wine bin has its own doorway, which I guess could have been locked. You know how you always have to lock up the liquor. One of the most interesting things that we found is about 2,000 small clay discs. These discs had been deliberately carved out of broken pieces of pottery. These 2,000 clay discs, I think, were counting tokens that the officials or the bureaucrats here at Kedesh used. When people came in, they would have come to the site. They would have brought, probably in sacks, their wheat or possibly in gourds, wine for their tax commodities. They would have delivered these things to the officials in the southern part of the building, dumped them into these bins, had everything accounted for, received some of these tokens, and then made their way up to the archive room where they could turn in the tokens and have their records squared away. So here's an aerial view of this giant 20,000 square foot building, and you can see a group of our excavators up in the upper right-hand corner standing on the outside to give you a sense of the scale of this compound. It really is enormous. The storeroom that you saw in the first place is right there, the archive complex there, the bin rooms there. But it's not just work at the compound at Kedesh in the 2nd century BCE. There was also apparently a fair amount of entertaining and a fair amount of partying going on in the rooms that I've just outlined in pink. So here are a whole series of rooms, 3 rooms side by side with beautiful decoration on the walls. You can see the lower parts of the walls here with the plaster decoration that was still left in place. And on the floors, we found hundreds and hundreds of fragments of brightly painted plaster, some with big panels painted in colors, some with architectural designs painted in fresco, and a reconstruction of the walls of these decorated rooms look like this. I can't say much about their color sense. I just will say that we do have evidence for all these colors meeting side by side together. So fashion in the 2nd century BCE up in the Upper Galilee. And lots of pottery showing us that they had plenty to eat and drink and beautiful vessels to eat and drink off of. And what's really interesting about all of these vessels is where they come from, because none of them are local to Kedesh. They all come from far away, either the city of Tyre on the coast, or in the case of the cooking vessels in the lower left, the coastal port of Ptolemais, or from Mediterranean producers, Rhodes, or from southern Turkey, the area of Cilicia, all of these fancy dishes, these black and red slip dishes. So perfume vessels, wine and oil vessels, cooking vessels, dishes, lamps, all of these things brought in to Kedesh from the port on the coast, showing the strong connection even across the territory of the rugged topography of the Upper Galilee. So all of that gives you a good sense of the topographic reality of Kedesh in the 2nd century BCE and the cultural reality. This was a place that was completely connected with the coast and under the jurisdiction of some official either based in Tyre or based at Kedesh. Probably the most fantastic piece of evidence for the importance of the site and its international connections is this spectacular discovery, which we made as all the very best of archaeological discoveries are made. You may know this, that the best discoveries, the most important discoveries are made at the last day of the last season. This gold coin, the largest gold coin ever found in Israel, one of the largest ever found in antiquity, we discovered in the last hour of the last day of the last week of the last month of the last season when we were cleaning for the last set of aerial photographs. In other words, this gold coin had been sitting inside a wall where we removed the stones to clean some of the dirt for the final photo. And the student who removed the stones saw something glittering and said, that's strange, and reached his hand in and pulled out the solid gold coin, which had been sitting inside this wall for all 10 years, every single summer, while we had been up there excavating. This gold coin was minted in Cyprus in the year 191 BCE. It belonged to the Egyptian king, Ptolemy V. But by the time that it was brought to Kedesh, Kedesh was under the jurisdiction of the Syrian kings, the Seleucids. So this, in other words, is an indication of some degree of high-level diplomacy, some meeting of generals or big officials, ambassadors, somebody like this. This coin would have been worth about 6 months of one high-ranking individual's salary. So You have to believe that it wasn't something that was lost. It had to have been something that was hidden, but nobody was ever able to come back to it. Now, I promised Ed that I would stop at a couple of points here in case there were some questions. So I'm coming back out from the presentation to ask if there are any questions.
Sure. Andrea, I'm getting some, we have some comments for you. First, Louise Goldstein says that she enjoyed sharing a tent with you at Beersheba in 1974.
Louise, that's fantastic. Welcome.
And I'm also getting texts of how much people are enjoying the lecture and a couple of questions. So here's one texted. Have you experienced difficulties excavating at Kedesh due to the political situation on the border?
That's a great question. Actually, we have not. So here's my favorite story about this. And I only can say that it's a very good thing that neither my mother nor my father can hear this at the moment. In 2006, was it 2006 when Israel pulled out of southern Lebanon? Now I can't remember if it was 2006 or 2008, but whichever season it was, in the run up to that, there was a certain amount of Katyusha bombing from southern Lebanon into northern Israel. And a lot of excavations in northern Israel had to leave the field. But not us. Why not? We are so close to the border that all the rockets went way over our head. Nobody was aiming that close to the border. So the rockets were hitting Rosh Pinah, and they were hitting Hatzor, and they were hitting the edge of the lower Galilee, but they were so far over our heads that we just stayed in the field and kept on excavating. So
I should have warned you in advance. This is being recorded, so your folks may see it. I have a couple other questions. Belinda asks, are excavations continuing there?
They are not. We have finished excavating the building, and we have so much material from excavating the building that we are now engaged in writing it all up for publication.
Good. What are the measurements of the gold coin?
The gold coin fits in the palm of my hand, almost completely covering the palm of my hand.
Oh my God.
So what is that?
Did you have to return it to the Israeli authorities?
I did, but I have a great story about the coin. So I was the person out. I have a co-director of this project, Sharon Herbert at the University of Michigan. And there are days when we take turns being the one out in the field. It was me out in the field the day that the coin was found. The student found the coin. Even before it was cleaned, you could tell it was a solid gold coin. You could see a little edge of it. You could feel how heavy it was. So he called me over. He said, close your eyes and put your hand out. I put my hand out. He put this thing in my hand, and I knew right away what it had to be. When I looked at it, I called our numismatist, Danny Sion, and I said, Danny, I think that we found a huge gold coin. What should I do? And he said, well, the best thing to do is put it in your pocket. And for the next 3 days, until the numismatist for the Israel Antiquities Authority could get to us, it was either in my pocket or under my pillow at night when I slept. And then the Israel Antiquities Authority sent somebody up and we handed it over.
Probably a relief to get it out of your possession at that point.
I was a little, yeah.
Well, great. We'll leave those questions and we'll come back to some more at the end. So please continue.
All righty. So we are moving back in time. You remember where we've been. We've been in the 2nd century BCE. In this building, 20,000 square feet, abandoned in haste, in the middle of that century. When we were excavating, we could see pretty quickly that there must be earlier phases of the building. Where I've just put these two yellow boxes, you can see that they outline stones that look different than most of the rest of the stones that comprise the walls. The rest of the stones are field stone, they're roughly shaped, but these stones that I've made an outline of are very smooth, large, finely finished ashlar blocks. And in the vicinity of these smooth, finely finished ashlar blocks were walls that had built into them column drums. Walls with column drums built into them. Now, you know, column drums, they're not really a very good building stone for a wall. For one thing, they're round. For another thing, they're long. You would really only bother to build a wall with column drums if you had some lying around or you had some that you just dismantled. Where might those column drums have been dismantled from? These smooth stones that are underneath the yellow highlighted area, every third one of them has a circular setting on it that is the same diameter as the drums. In other words, these things were what we call in the Greek architectural tradition stylobates. They were foundations that supported columns. Originally, they must have extended this one stylobate must have extended further along this way, and this one will have had originally another return that went like that. Underneath and partially within the walls of the 2nd century BCE building is the imprint of an earlier building, which you can see here outlined in purple. In the entrance to that earlier building came in from the east through an open air court that was framed by columns. 2 larger columns walking between those columns led to a large western courtyard. Small remnants of ceramics from the areas around here allowed us to date the original construction of the building to the 5th century BCE. That's 300 years earlier. This building had originally been built around the year 500 BCE. What's going on around the year 500 BCE? Well, this is the period of the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Achaemenid Persian Empire was the largest land empire in antiquity. It extended from the shores of the Mediterranean, including modern-day Turkey and parts of Egypt, all the way across the Levant, modern-day Iraq and Iran, and all the way towards Afghanistan. Its capital was at the magnificent city of Persepolis, which you see here in its grand ceremonial palatial wonderment. And presiding over all was the Persian king, who you see here elevated on a high throne with many officials and soldiers and courtiers surrounding him. In the 5th century BCE at Kedesh, the small finds that date from that period show us the affiliations of the people who were living here at that time, the affiliations of the people who built this building, this giant compound, around the year 500. For one thing, you see here in the upper right, a beautiful tiny green jasper scarab, the underside of which is carved with the face of a bearded man. He has a kind of fancy hairdo with a headband holding up his curls and a beard. He looks very, very similar to one of the officials on the sculpted reliefs at Persepolis. In other words, Persian fashion was the fashion at Kedesh in the 5th century BCE, as was loyalty to the Persian king. This is a glass seal stone. So a glass seal stone, this is an object of decoration. This is an adornment, like something that you would wear on your neck, like as a necklace. You can see the little hole perforated in it. And the underside of it is carved with a figure of the Persian king himself in his mighty heroic mode as master of animals. This is very, very similar to ceilings that are found on some of the tablets from Persepolis itself. Here again is the Persian king. You can see same hairdo, same dress, same jagged crown, and same activity, knocking a lion on a head. The Persian king is mighty. The Persian king is large. The lion doesn't stand a chance. And so it is on the ceiling from Persepolis, and so it is on the little glass seal from Kedesh. So these are two objects showing that whoever lived here was part of the larger fashion of the Persian Empire of the day. But there's a third of these little objects, another of these glass ceilings. And on the underside of that is a quite different figure. This figure is very recognizable because he has a huge scimitar and these adorable pantaloons. This is the Tyrian god Melkart, the main god, deity of the city of Tyre. And Melkart is here in a guise very similar to that of the Persian king, as a master of animals. So we have a well-connected Phoenician or Tyrian. We have people living here who had fancy stone bowls and glass perfume bottles and alabaster stone perfume bottles and bronze bracelets and silver earrings and all the accoutrements that show elites or bourgeois, or anyway, people who are well connected and in the know, both with the Persian rulers to the east and the Tyrians to the west. What are they doing at Kedesh in the 5th century BCE? We can tell largely what they're doing from the pottery that's left to us. Most of the pottery, and we've got thousands and thousands of pieces of pottery from the 5th and the 4th centuries BCE, this period of Persian rule. Most of the pottery are jars, the tops, the fragments of jars. Not very much is whole from this period because these are really, really old, and the building continued to be inhabited. So because the building continued to be inhabited, everything from these earlier periods is just left to us in very tiny fragments. But the jars that you can see in the lower left, they are for agricultural commodities. Wide mouth jars for grain, for dry goods, and narrow mouth jars like the one that's in the front there, probably for liquid commodities, I would suppose for wine. Incidentally, you see in this modern aerial view of the site, you see its location? It is at the head of a big valley. Can you tell what that is planted in the valley? Those are grapevines. This valley in the far north of the country is actually one of the best places to grow Cabernet Sauvignon grapes. And there are lots of boutique wineries up in this neck of the woods. And it seems that wine, as well as grain, was a prized commodity in the 5th century BCE as well, from all of these narrow-necked jars that we find at Kedesh. We also find a fair amount of pottery at the site, which comes from Tyre. And what that tells us is that just like in the 2nd century BCE, in the 5th century, 300 years earlier, Kedesh was connected to the coast. Kedesh was connected to Tyre. Probably some of these pots from Tyre came in from people who were picking up agricultural goods, grain, and wine and taking that back to people at the coast. So there was some kind of regular market connection between the interior, between Kedesh and the coast. Now, in the 5th century BCE, Kedesh is not the only site in the region of the eastern Upper Galilee Plateau. About 10 kilometers to the south is another site on the edge of the plateau, Kerem bin Zimra. About 10 kilometers to the south of that, there's another Persian period site, Ayelet HaShachar. And about 10 kilometers south of that, at the very edge of the Upper Galilee Plateau, overlooking the Sea of Galilee, overlooking the Kinneret, is the site of Mitzpeh Yamim. As the name Mitzpeh Yamim suggests, from the height here, looking to the southwest, you could almost see the Mediterranean. On a clear day, you could see the Mediterranean. It wasn't exactly such a clear day when I took this shot. And if you were looking to the southeast, you could see the Kinneret, you could see the Sea of Galilee. So Mitzpeh Yamim meant the height of the seas. From the height of it, you could see both the seas. What was up here? Well, there was a watchtower. That makes sense, a big watchtower for somebody to guard and overlook the pass and the plain below. There was a little shrine, a little 2-room shrine. There was some fancy objects found in this shrine, a schist statuette group of Egyptian deities and little bronze weights and a bronze situla that you see here with a Phoenician inscription on it. But the most interesting thing were about 100 small perfume vessels. Why are these so interesting? Because the perfume vessels are made of clay, and we can analyze the clay and we can know where it comes from. And it comes from Tyre. 100 small perfume vessels on the height of Mitzpeh Yamim, all brought from Tyre. So just like from Kedesh in the 5th century BCE, there was regular traffic to and from the coast and the city of Tyre and this border sanctuary at Mitzpeh Yamim. In other words, throughout the Persian period, the entirety of the Upper Galilee belonged to Tyre. The entirety of the Upper Galilee belonged to Tyre. That is not any part of the story we think of when we think of the Persian period. When we think of the Persian period, the story we think of is the story we know from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And that's the story of the return of the exiles from Babylon back to Judah. That is something that happens under the Persian king. The Persian king sends the Babylonian exiles back to Judah. He allows them to resettle in Jerusalem. He allows them to rebuild the temple. The map that you're looking at here is a typical sort of map that you will find if you have any kind of a dictionary or an encyclopedia about the history of Israel through antiquity to today. And in this map, you see this line that separates the Phoenician coast from the Galilean interior. What's the evidence for that line? Well, the evidence is the Book of Chronicles. The evidence, in other words, is a Hebrew text. But what we now understand from the archaeology is that just as the Persian king repatriated the Jews and allowed them to move back to Judah, he gave to the Tyrians an equally significant territory, a huge territory that comprised the entirety of the Upper Galilee and probably portions of the Lower Galilee as well. And the obvious question to ask here is, why? What is the Persian king up to? Why is he so interested in gifting the Tyrians with this huge territory? Well, for those of you that remember your ancient history, in the 5th century BCE, the Persian king had designs on Greece. The Persian Empire was big, it was mighty, it was the largest land empire in antiquity, but you know something, an empire can always be bigger. And then the Persian king was very interested in expanding his empire more to the west. He had his eye on the Greek lands. If you know anything about waging geopolitical, territorial expansion, you know that if you want to conquer Greece, you need ships. The Persian Empire was a land empire. The Persians didn't have ships. The Persians needed people who did. Who had ships? The Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, all the Phoenician city-states. In fact, we know from the ancient historian Herodotus that the kings of Tyre and the kings of Sidon, the two largest Phoenician cities on the eastern Mediterranean coast in the 5th century BCE, were themselves present with the Persian king in the final battle of the wars that were fought between the Greeks and the Persians in the 480s and in 479 BCE. Well, that war didn't work out too good for the Persian king, but it sure did work out well for the Phoenicians. Now we're going to enter the very last stretch of this lecture. And before we get to that, I thought maybe I would stop one more time and see if there are any questions.
I have one more from a text. Estimate the population of Kedesh in the Persian period and then in the Hasmonean period.
That is a great, great question. Remember the size of the mound, 1 kilometer from north to south? Remember the image that showed how much we dug? This much? So, just can't tell. Don't know how densely the mound was occupied.
So other than the backside, no exploratory excavation efforts at all?
We have some probes here and there, but in none of those probes do we get down to these levels. And, you know, we started those probes in the first and the second seasons as we were continuing to excavate the building. And as we came to understand the size of the building and how much effort it was going to take to uncover the extent of it, we said, you know something, we're just going to focus on this big building. And that's what we did. So somebody else is going to have to come along and excavate the rest of the mound.
Perhaps one of your students.
Perhaps.
Here's another. How did you know where to probe?
How do
you make that decision?
Oh, that's a great, great question. Well, yeah, I didn't show you guys some of the initial slides showing our survey, but so the whole mound in the spring and the summer is covered with tall thistles. And we scraped a series of survey squares, 10 by 10 survey squares that ran the length of the lower mound. We scraped down to dirt, and then we sort of crawled around on those squares, and we picked up every single little piece of antiquity, material antiquity, ceramic usually, that we found on the squares. And then my co-director Sharon and I, we each got to pick 2 of the squares, and we got to pick 1 spot each in those squares. So she picked a square on the edge of the mound where she thought she would find a piece of fortification wall. And I picked that square where you saw the little elevator shaft. And the reason I picked it is because one of the tiny little pieces of pottery was just the same shape as a piece of pottery from my dissertation. And I just thought, oh, this is like a sign. So that's where we dug.
The Persian period finds were fascinating. Did you find evidence of the earlier Assyrian invasion of the area?
Oh, really an excellent question. Immediately below the Persian period building, there is an Iron Age building. Mm-hmm. The Iron Age building, which we only uncovered in a couple of tiny little spots, looks to date to the 8th century BCE, which is the date of the Neo-Assyrian expansion into this region. We didn't see any evidence for destruction, although we only have a couple of tiny spots. And it does appear that one could make a hypothesis that on account of the Neo-Assyrian expansion, the site was abandoned in the 8th century.
Okay, good. Regarding there's a couple questions regarding the seals. Do you think that this was this is about the seat, sorry. Did you think that this was the seat of the local satrap? Is there a particular name for this region, for the district, satrapy?
So the entirety of the satrapy is Ever-Nahari, which means in Aramaic, the land beyond the river. And the river in question is the Euphrates, because you have to remember the perspective of the Persians is east. They're at Persepolis in what is today southern Iran. So they are looking across the Euphrates towards the west. And our satrapy is the satrapy across the river on the other side of the Euphrates to the west. We know that the satrapal capital of Ever-Nahari, the land beyond the river, is quite a bit north of Kedesh. It's probably actually in the region of Cilicia, more or less where modern day Antakya or ancient Antioch was. There was a sub-governor in Damascus, a pachad. We know that from Aramaic documents, that there was a pachad, a governor, in Damascus. Damascus is not that far from Kedesh. What we think is that, in fact, the closest Persian official was in Damascus, and Kedesh was the furthest east of the Tyrian royal house. So the Tyrian royal house is like a client state under the Persians, and that makes Kedesh actually Tyrian in the Persian period, not Persian politically.
Any plans to continue excavations there by anyone?
There's actually a huge project going on right now at Kedesh by a team from Hebrew University. They are exploring, get this, everybody, the 3rd millennium BCE. They're interested in the early Bronze Age. So that is the project and the team that actually is working at the site now. They're not working in our part of the site. They're working way at the northern end of the site, the upper Tel, even closer to the border. And so far, what they in fact, they just published a beautiful large article. The site in the 3rd millennium BC was enormous. It had a big fortification wall. So they're uncovering evidence that Kedesh was what they are calling a mega site in the 3rd millennium BCE. It's going to be exciting to see what they find.
I'll let you continue. We have a few more questions, but we'll let you continue.
All righty. Well, we've had a story of territory and politics and geopolitics and quid pro quo and connections. And all of it has been a story that we've told from finds on the ground. And now what I'd like to end up with is considering a comparison between the way territory is claimed and the way we know about it. A comparison between the way it's claimed on the ground and on the page. 5th century BCE, 2 big territorial authorities or constituencies. You could sort of call them powers, small powers, in this region. The Jews, the Judeans, down in the Central Hills, in the southern part of the Central Hills, and the Tyrians in the coast and the region that we know of as Galilee. Let's return to the 2nd century BCE, the time of the Maccabees. One of the things that we learned about the 5th century BCE is that the lines on the map that we get from the texts, you can't really trust those texts, and you can't really trust those lines. And we're going to see if we can trust those texts and trust those lines in the time of the Maccabees. So I told you all to remember something. I told you to remember this text, this episode. Jonathan heard that the generals of Demetrius had come with a strong force to Kedesh in Galilee. He went to meet them. The army of the foreigners made an ambush. All of Jonathan's men fled. Jonathan rent his garments and prayed. He turned them again to battle. They fought. They pursued their enemies to Kedesh. 3,000 of the foreign troops fell, and Jonathan returned to Jerusalem. What is the date? Do you remember? Now, I'm really, really sorry. We are not all in a room together where one of you could raise your hand and tell me, but I hope you remember. This is the date of the battle, 143 BCE. So here you've got the story. Here you've got the place. Here you've got the date. What was really happening on the ground? We will go back 2 years before the year 143, 2 years before that battle. 2 years before that battle, in the year 145 BCE, Ptolemy VI, the king of Egypt, set his sights on regaining the entirety of the southern Levant. He marched his army up the coastal road from Gaza, through the coastal plain, through the Phoenician city-states, and all the way up to the Seleucid capital at Antioch. He took Antioch, he fought a battle, he won, he was crowned king of the united territories of the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire, and then 3 days later, suffering from wounds that he had received in the battle, he died. And with his death, 2 years of intense civil war immediately broke out. By the year 143, there were 2 competitors fighting for control of the entirety of this strategic, fertile, important coastal region. One was the Seleucid general Tryphon, and the other was a Seleucid scion of the royal house named Demetrius. We know from their minting patterns, from the coins that they minted, where they were in control. It is amazing and actually a little scary to see the pattern here, because what you can tell is that they each controlled almost every other major city on the coast. In other words, neither one of them could gather enough contiguous territory to hold on and get rid of the other one. They were equally matched, and they were equally enraged at each other. You know, one of the things that we tend to think about in the ancient world is, well, they were at war all the time, those kings, empires, they rose and they fall, destructions all over the place. But archaeologically, that's not really true. We don't actually find that much evidence, repeated evidence, catastrophic evidence. When we do find it, it's the exception. It's not the rule. In the middle of the 2nd century BCE, we're in one of those exceptions. In the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the backyards of 2 of these big cities, Tyre, controlled by Demetrius, and Ptolemais, controlled by Tryphon, was ground zero for their battles. How do we know? Because surveys and excavations throughout the Lower Galilee and the Upper Galilee have discovered that in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, almost every single settled site was destroyed and or abandoned. It is an astonishing moment, the likes of which we rarely see. The entirety of the Upper Galilee, the backyard of Tyre, and the entirety of the Lower Galilee, the backyard of Ptolemais, were devastated. These must have been the turf wars of the generals of Tryphon and Demetrius. So in the year 143 BCE, these two territories are vacated. And for something like 25 years, there's very little on the ground up here. By the year 120, the Jews, the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, whatever you want to call them down in Judah, had become people without a political competitor in the region. The Seleucids, the Seleucid Civil War that had destroyed the settlements of Galilee, had also destroyed the Seleucid royal house. It effectively was no more. And that meant that there were large tracts of interior rural land that people could just move to. And in the last 2 decades of the 2nd century BCE, that's exactly what happened. Judeans moved north to the Galilee. And at the same time that these Judeans moved north to the Galilee, a few sites got established to mark and guard, and perhaps also set a warning to other people who were living in this region. One of these sites is exactly next to Kedesh. Kedesh wasn't occupied by this time, but immediately next to Kedesh was a fort right on the edge of the plateau, the Kedesh Valley, overlooking the Hula Valley at a site called Keren Naphtali. Why is there a Hasmonean fort overlooking the Hula Valley? Because down in the Hula Valley, there were a whole series of Tyrian settlements. The Tyrians moved into the Hula Valley and created a whole neighborhood of rural estates. The largest of them and the most extensively excavated is a site called Tel Anafah, and you're looking here at an aerial view of Tel Anafah. From Keren Naphtali, the view on the top, you can look right down on the Tyrian villa at Tel Anafah. This is the last 2 decades of the 2nd century BCE. And this is the context of the story that we started with. This is the date that the story in 1 Maccabees 11 was written down. And you know, one of the things about history, often it's more important for the time it is written than for the time that it tells about. So in these last 2 decades of the 2nd century, how was the tale told of what happened up here? Jonathan heard that the generals of Demetrius had come to Kedesh. He went to meet them. He turned them to battle. He defeated them. 3,000 of the foreign troops fell. Jonathan returned to Jerusalem. There are 2 players, Demetrius and Jonathan. There are 2 sites, Kedesh and Jerusalem. There is one story, and it's a simple story. It's a story of Hasmonean conquest. It's a story that explains how it is right for the Jews to be living up here. It's a story in which those encamped at Keren Naphtali belong, and those living at Tel Anafah should go home. It is not the story that we know from archaeology. But that's the thing about history. You can live it or you can tell it. Luckily, we have people to dig it up so that we can read what's told and know what really happened. Thanks, everybody.
Simply outstanding. Thank you, Andrea. And I'll invite everybody to applaud. I can hear them applauding as it is. Very good hearing. When we do have a couple of questions, I want to ask a question from Cinzia Olianis. She's joining us from Italy right now, so buona notte. And she asked, I would like to ask a question. How many of those ceilings were found total, and have they been found in nearby sites, similar things?
Two excellent questions, easily answered. We have about 2,000 ceilings, and no.
Okay. Here's a question regarding the border. Is there any possibility, you mentioned the border, the difference between the textual account and the archaeological account. Is there any possibility that the border is the same as it is mentioned in Chronicles, but there was trade between Tyre and Kedesh? Obviously, the artifacts can prove trade, but I'm not sure it only means our notion of the border in Chronicles is wrong.
I am not even sure I understand that question.
But I think the question is, so what you present challenges the statement about border, the definition of border in Chronicles. And is there, I think he's stating is, we can see trade. Does that necessarily mean border?
So I think what I'm saying is that Kedesh, and I think that what the archaeology shows us is that Kedesh and Tyre are strongly linked. And what the archaeology also shows us is that Kedesh is not linked culturally, economically, to places south. It's not linked to Judea or even to Lower Galilee. All the finds are from the west. So I don't know if what a border would even mean. I think I would just say Kedesh was tied to the coast and not tied to the area to the south of it, down to the time that First Maccabees is written, down to the aftermath of the Civil War when Judeans start moving up here. I hope
Just
that.
so you know, you're getting applause from Jerusalem, Montreal, Chicago, Italy.
Wow, thank you, everybody.
And everybody is just really thanking you for a great lecture. You'll want to read all of these. One other question, if I can find it again. Please, I won't read the first part. He's claiming it's not, comes from ignorance, but it's not. It's a great question. These leaders like Demetrius, Tryphon, and others, for them, was life expectancy fairly short for these people?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question.
I guess if you lose the battle, yes.
Tryphon is eventually holed up in the city of Dor and besieged by Antiochus the Seventh Sidetes. He dies youngish. I mean, it's a little live by the sword, die by the sword kind of thing. You know, yeah, I mean, there aren't very many of these kings who last long because they get themselves in trouble. There are a few. Antiochus III lived out his life. He was in his 60s or something when he died. And I think Antiochus IV also. But a lot of them die in battle. So, yeah.
You're also getting regards from Tucson, so very close. From Beth.
Oh, I bet.
Well, everybody, I want to thank you, Andrea, once again for a great talk. And you definitely will want to read all the comments and things. We'll leave those up. I'll tell everyone that this lecture was recorded and we'll put up on our YouTube channel. You can access that from judaic.arizona.edu. And we have 3 more lectures coming up in the next 2 months, and announcements about those will be going out shortly. Andrea, once again, thank you for providing this year's Pattay lecture. I want to thank Daphne Pattay and Jennifer Snyder once again for making this possible. And it's just a way to extend the reach of the center and our great friends who come in and share with us like you have tonight. Thank you, Andrea. And we'll see you and everyone else next time.
Thanks, everybody.